This is New Clark City, around 9,450 hectares, one of the largest development projects the Philippine government has ever attempted. And inside it, the government is proposing a 1,600-hectare hub, around 4,000 acres, for semiconductors, AI infrastructures, critical mineral processing and research under a US-led initiative called Pax Silica. The government says the hub could attract up to $70 billion in investments and create hundreds of thousands of jobs. But critics see something very different. They say we are giving away land, power, and water for industries Filipinos may never control. So I wanted to get to the bottom of this. I talked to a business leader backing it and to people from labor and technology groups questioning it. And I wrote to the government agencies that may eventually have a say here and in Washington, the Tax Board, the Indigenous Peoples Commission. So what exactly is Pax Silica and who would actually benefit? Let's start with the basics, Pax Silica itself. This is where it gets interesting because the site that we just saw, that's only the Philippine part. It began in December 2025 as a partnership between countries involved in technology and manufacturing. The basic idea is to build more secure supply chains for the industries behind artificial intelligence. Because an AI supply chain can stretch across several countries, minerals such as nickel and copper might come from one place, specialized machines from another, including the EUV lithography systems made only by the Dutch company ASML. And most of the world's leading-edge logic chips are made in Taiwan. And even after the chip is made, the wider AI system around it still depends on energy, shipping, data centers, and digital infrastructures. But because these parts are spread across so many countries, a disruption in one place can affect everything that comes after it. The goal of Pax Silica is to make the chain harder to disrupt by getting countries the United States considers trusted partners to work together. The Philippines joined Pax Silica in April 2026, making it the 13th signatory. And around the same time, the Philippine government proposed New Clark City in Capas, Tarlac as the location of the Philippine hub. And the location makes a lot more sense when we trace the wider Luzon Economic Corridor, another initiative intended to connect Subic, Clark, Metro Manila, and Batangas. The corridor would provide links to ports, airports, cities, and other industrial areas, while New Clark City would provide the land where the actual facilities could be built. And when the government calls this a hub, it doesn't mean one enormous Pax Silica factory run by one company. The site would actually work more like an industrial district where different companies could establish semiconductor facilities, data centers, mineral processing plants, research centers, and the infrastructure needed to support them. So that's Pax Silica and where it will go, but we haven't answered the most important question. Why was BCDA, the Philippine agency that manages New Clark City, willing to make around 4,000 acres available for this hub? Well, to understand that, let's first look at the electronics industry the Philippines already has. And when it comes to electronics, the Philippines isn't exactly starting from zero. In 2025, electronics exports were worth around $49.6 billion, roughly 59% of all Philippine goods exports that year. But that figure doesn't tell us what role the Philippine government actually plays in making a semiconductor chip. And to understand what the government wants to change, we first need to understand that role. Making a chip is difficult, and it takes several stages. It first has to be designed, then it must be fabricated. Fabrication is essentially where microscopic circuits are built onto a thin disk of silicon called a wafer. And after that, the individual chips are then cut from the wafer, placed into packages and tested to make sure they actually work. And this is where the Philippines enters the process. A lot of the work done in the Philippines happens in those later stages: assembly, testing, and packaging. And it's been a big part of the Philippine economy for decades, supporting a large Filipino workforce and helping make electronics the country's biggest export industry. The problem from the government's point of view is that much of the design, the patents, the specialized machinery, and the biggest company decisions still come from abroad. So even though the Philippines has a big electronics industry and exports tens of billions a year, it doesn't really own or control much of the technology behind what it exports. And this is basically what officials mean when they say they want the Philippines to move up the value chain. They want more of the difficult engineering, research, and design to happen here. They also want Filipino suppliers and workers to take on more valuable parts of the process. I also interviewed Perry Ferrer, the president of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, or PCCI, and when I asked him why PCCI supports Pax Silica, he gave me a surprisingly direct answer about the jobs.
I know many people say, oh, Perry, I'm always in interviews. Perry, you're going to get only the low paying jobs. The answer to that is yes, if we don't get our act together, we will. We want to be part of the development. We want to be part of the R&D down the road, users of uh, not just users of AI. We want to be the one developing it. And this Pax Silica will give us the opportunity.
One of the activities being proposed for Pax Silica is advanced packaging. Now, that sounds like a low-value part of the industry. Is it just a better way of putting a finished chip inside a protective case? Well, it can be much more complicated than that. Some of the newest AI processors combine a main processor, several smaller chips, and stacks of high-speed memory. Advanced packaging connects those pieces closely enough to work as one system. Those connections affect how quickly data moves, how much power is used, and how heat is controlled. So packaging doesn't automatically mean the Philippines will continue doing exactly the same work it already does. If the hub brings advanced equipment, research, and difficult engineering work here, this could be a real industrial upgrade. But wanting to move up the value chain is one thing. Convincing companies to bring more valuable work here is another, and this is where the timing matters. The United States is trying to reduce its dependence on China for critical minerals, semiconductors, and other technologies it considers important. That gives the Philippines a chance to compete for investments, looking for somewhere else to go. And the government believes the country has something to offer: workers with electronics experience, large industrial sites, a long standing alliance with the United States, and mineral resources such as nickel. And nickel is an important part of this. Much of the nickel the Philippines currently exports leaves as ore or concentrate before the more advanced processing that turns it into higher value products. The government wants more of that processing to happen here before the nickel is exported. And the goal is basically the same as it is for semiconductors: keep more of the valuable work inside the Philippines. There's an article by Alvin Campbell published by the Lowy Institute. He argues that this could be the Philippines' best opening since the 1970s to move into higher value production. His point is that Washington now needs trusted suppliers, and that gives the Philippines something more valuable to bargain with than cheap labor alone. And there's another reason why a project like this may look attractive to the government. BPO has been one of the country's most important sources of jobs and growth, but AI is beginning to change some of that work. An IMF study estimated that around 1 in 3 Philippine workers are in occupations highly exposed to AI. Now, I'm not saying those jobs will disappear. AI may also make workers more productive. But BPO had the highest proportion of jobs at risk of displacements among the sectors the IMF studied. So it's all coming together, isn't it? The Philippines wants to move into higher value semiconductor and nickel production while one of its biggest industries faces pressures from AI. That creates another argument for Pax Silica. Use the same technology boom to help build another source of jobs and growth. But that still leaves the question of the land itself. Why make around 4,000 acres available instead of simply attracting one factory? Well, it's not like opening another call center. If several technology companies establish facilities in the same area, they could share infrastructure. One factory could give a Filipino supplier its first major customer, and another could give that supplier its second. Over time, workers could learn specialized skills, universities could adjust their courses, and more companies might follow. That's the hope behind building a hub. One investment could make the next investment easier. As of July 23, BCDA said around 30 companies had expressed interest. An early sign the government says that there could be a real opportunity here. But its biggest projections look much further ahead. BCDA now expects the project to take around 30 years to reach full development, and this is where the numbers become enormous. BCDA says Pax Silica could attract 10 billion in initial investment, eventually rising to somewhere between 40 and 70 billion. Then there are the jobs. BCDA projects between 130,000 and 190,000 direct jobs, plus another 500,000 to 800,000 indirect and induced jobs through suppliers and workers' spending. And here's the big question, the one you're probably already asking. Who would actually get them? BCDA says fewer than 10% will go to foreign workers, mostly in senior decision-making positions. The majority, it says, will be filled by Filipinos. BCDA describes this as a chance to turn brain drain into brain gain, where Filipino engineers, researchers, and other skilled workers can build their careers here instead of leaving the country. If the hub reaches full development, BCDA projects up to $200 billion in export earnings over that 30-year period. BCDA also projects between 66 billion pesos and 75 billion pesos in annual withholding taxes and around 60 billion pesos in lease income over 25 years. So if even a large part of those projections become real, Pax Silica could become one of the biggest industrial developments in Philippine history. And that explains why the government wants it. Later, I asked Ferrer whether BCDA's $70 billion projection was actually achievable. This was his answer.
The numbers, your question, is it achievable? The answer is yes, but there's a lot of homework we need to do because without reliable power, without reliable water, there's no investors. Then that 70 billion that you were saying, even 1/10 of that will not happen if that basic infrastructure will not be in place.
So now we come to the opposition. Why are so many people, union groups, and even technology professionals opposing this initiative? You've seen the criticism on YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok, and there isn't one single argument. Labor and technology groups question the jobs and ownership. Scientists and environmental groups ask about land, water, and power. Others worry about sovereignty and the project's connection to the United States. Lawmakers are now even calling for a congressional inquiry. Some people want the project stopped, while others want stronger safeguards and more information. But most of the concern begins in the same place. The government has offered land and a rent-free period, while the Philippines bring workers, minerals, and a strategic location to an American supply chain plan. What Filipinos would actually control in return is still unclear. Just to be clear, many critics aren't against semiconductors, technology, or artificial intelligence. Their argument is about who would control the industry, who will benefit, and who will bear the cost. One of those critics is Ian Aragosa, the spokesperson of the Computer Professionals Union, which remained opposed to Pax Silica when we spoke. This is how he described their position.
But to be clear, the Computer Professionals Union isn't opposed to industrialization. We're not anti-technology here. We actually want the Philippines to be able to capacitate itself, make industries to be able to create the resources that we need. So the CPU is for industrialization, but we believe that we don't have to sell ourselves to other countries just to industrialize, right? There is a better way to do national industrialization.
So think back to what we discussed earlier. The Philippines exports many minerals before they undergo advanced processing, while much of the semiconductor work remains concentrated in assembly and testing. In both industries, much of the technology and the biggest decision remain abroad. CPU disagrees with the government's proposed solution. From CPU's point of view, the United States knows what it wants: new source of minerals, chips, and computing infrastructure outside China. But what would Filipino companies own? What will workers be paid? What technologies will remain? And what happens if the companies leave? Those questions are at the heart of the opposition. So let's compare what is already on the table with what is still only being discussed. The government has offered around 4,000 acres of state-controlled land and the first 2 years without rent. BCDA says around 30 companies have shown interest. Finance Secretary Frederick Go has even publicly named Foxconn as the planned anchor. But by early August, no tenant agreement or construction plan for Foxconn has been made public. So how far had any of this actually gone? Here's where I can show you something. I wrote to the Fiscal Incentives Review Board, or FIRB, which can review the country's biggest tax incentive packages. Companies apply through an investment promotion agency first. Only projects above 15 billion pesos would require FIRB approval. But between January 1 and July 30, the Secretariat said it received no application, endorsement, or even a preliminary inquiry concerning incentives for the zone. It had also not been consulted about the zone's fiscal terms, and neither the FIRB Secretariat nor the National Tax Research Center had modeled BCDA's projected tax and lease income. Companies could still be speaking privately with BCDA or approaching other agencies first. But while the government was describing what Pax Silica could become, the agency that could eventually review its biggest incentive packages had nothing in front of it. The broad Philippine offer is already on the table, while much of what the country would receive remains a forecast. And the clock is ticking here. BCDA says the two governments are aiming to sign a framework agreement in November, which is only a few months away. But at the same time, the lawmakers behind House Resolution 1227 want Congress to examine the project's claimed economic benefits, labor standards, electricity and water demand, effects on communities, and national security implications before the project moves further. So if lawmakers want to examine the framework before it is signed, the window is short. Company leases, incentives, and permits are separate from the framework, but the framework could shape the rules around them. Now let's assume an agreement is signed, and companies do come. When you sort through everything the opposition is saying, it really comes down to four questions. Who actually gets the jobs? Who gives up the land? Who pays for the water and power? And who's really in control? Let's take them one at a time. Let's start with the jobs, and opponents aren't only asking how many there will be, they're asking what kind of jobs they will be. If we use the middle of BCDA's projections, the agency is effectively saying that every direct job would help create around 4 more jobs elsewhere. That could happen, but the model isn't public, so we don't know what the jobs it counted or what assumptions it used. How many will come from construction? How many will remain afterwards? What will they pay? And how many Filipinos would work in engineering, research, management, and senior decision-making roles? I also interviewed Joshua Mata of the labor organization Centro. Centro hadn't adopted an official position on Pax Silica when we spoke, but Mata said the organization was studying the project and was deeply concerned about it.
That's fine. You can create jobs from construction, but right after construction, how much jobs do data centers actually need? So our question is, so where are these projections being based on?
To be fair, BCDA says only about 1 or 2 interested companies are data center operators. The hub is also supposed to contain factories, mineral processing facilities, and research centers, so a data center can't represent the entire project. BCDA also says fewer than 10% of the projected workers will be foreigners, and that most of the jobs would go to Filipinos. But that still doesn't tell us which jobs. A factory can employ mostly Filipino workers, while its research and management remain abroad. Its patents stay foreign-owned, and its biggest decisions are made elsewhere. So the opposition isn't saying Pax Silica would create no jobs. It's asking whether Filipinos will get the valuable and permanent parts of the work. Ayler, a labor research institute, argues that parts of their existing electronics industries have already been marked by low wages, contractualization, unsafe work, and repression of unions. Aragosa also said that, in his own case, moving to the country where his employer is based could mean earning 5 to 10 times as much. So critics aren't only asking how many Filipinos would work inside the hub, they are asking whether those jobs will be secure, well paid, and protected, and whether Filipino companies would own any part of the industry around them. This is how Ian Aragosa explained that concern.
But the question is, who owns it in the end, right? Who gets to benefit from it in the end?
Now, one number can hide a lot of this. Export value. Imagine that a product leaves Pax Silica with an export value of $100. If some of the wafers, chemicals, software, or design came from abroad, the full $100 will still appear in the export figure, the number you'll see in the headlines, even though part of that value was created somewhere else. What matters is how much value was added in the Philippines through Filipino workers, local suppliers, research, and other work done here. And that is why hosting a large industry and controlling that industry are not the same thing. The concern isn't even new. The Philippines has already hosted one of the largest semiconductor companies in the world. Intel opened its first production facility outside the United States in Penang, Malaysia in 1972. It entered the Philippines 2 years later and stayed for more than 3 decades. But in 2009, during a global restructuring, Intel closed its Cavite facility and around 1,800 jobs were lost. But here's what you have to understand. Intel also closed 2 assembly and testing facilities in Penang during that same restructuring. But unlike Cavite, that wasn't the end of Intel in Malaysia. Around 1,000 affected workers were expected to move to other Intel facilities in Penang and Kulim. One important difference was the wider industry Penang had built. Other semiconductor companies had arrived, local suppliers served several factories, and training centers prepared workers for the wider industry. So when those 2 Intel facilities closed, Penang's semiconductor industry did not disappear with them.
Do we have the requisite downstream and upstream kind of the industries that will make sure that this is actually linked to the internal development of the economy? Otherwise, we will just end up like what we have been doing, what we have right now in export processing zones, which means we're just merely providers of labor, cheap labor for that matter.
Put plainly, Mata is asking, would Filipino companies supply the factories, learn from them, and eventually own more of the technology? Or will the hub import most of what it needs while the Philippines mainly provides land and labor? Penang spent decades building a wider system. In 1989, industry, government, and universities established the Penang Skills Development Center. Foreign firms remained important, but by 2009, the industry was no longer dependent on one factory alone. Intel Philippines also created jobs, trained workers, and became one of the country's biggest exporters, but it remained foreign-owned, and the biggest decisions about future products and investments were made abroad. That is the economic fear behind much of the opposition. Pax Silica could become another successful export zone without enough Filipino companies, technology, or skills developing around it. Mata argues that the Philippines should first decide which industries and capabilities it wants to develop and then decide how foreign companies can help build them. Otherwise, the American supply chain plan comes first and the Philippines' own industrial plan comes later. And this next part is where my own reporting comes in, because I checked one of the most confident claims in this whole debate, and the government agency responsible for verifying it told me in writing that it can't. But deciding what the Philippines wants from Pax Silica isn't only about jobs and technology, it also means deciding what the country is willing to provide: land, electricity, and water. And those choices will affect people outside the hub too. So that was the first question, the jobs. The second one is the land. The government says the proposed site is public land, already designated for industrial development. BCDA says around 10 farmers will be directly affected and has spoken about helping them find other ways to earn a living, including farming methods designed for smaller spaces. But AGHAM, an organization of Filipino scientists, engineers, and science advocates, argues that the effects could extend beyond the people BCDA counts as directly affected. It points to 3 communities in Capas, O'Donnell, Aranguren, and Santa Lucia. For AGHAM, displacement can also mean losing access to the land, water, or livelihood someone depends on, even if their home lies outside the project site. You may have heard that thousands of farmers and indigenous people could be affected. But those members came from the larger New Clark City dispute in 2019. They are not the estimates for this smaller Pax Silica site. Even so, the history matters. Some communities already had concerns about how New Clark City was developed. So when another large project moves forward before the public can see exactly where it will go, it can feel like the same thing is happening again. And to be clear, the public still can't see the exact parcel boundary. In response to a Freedom of Information request, BCDA disclosed the project's general location, size, and scope, but withheld the parcel blueprint and perimeter coordinates while negotiations were ongoing. It later published a broad proposed site map. That's why every map in this video shows an approximate area, not an exact parcel boundary. Ferrer also addressed indigenous land, and he sounded certain.
There was a question they were interviewing this morning about the indigenous people. We are not touching that. The project is outside any titled ancestral domain, definitely. So we will not touch that.
But NCIP could not verify that claim. On August 3, the agency told me it couldn't determine whether the project overlaps or sits beside an ancestral domain because BCDA had not provided its exact location. NCIP has also received no application for either of the certifications used to settle that question, and no free and prior informed consent process had begun. The agency was still waiting for the exact map. Then we have to talk about energy. At full development, BCDA says Pax Silica could require around 3 gigawatts of electricity. Luzon's demand will be larger by the time the hub is completed. But to understand the scale, 3 gigawatts is equal to almost 1/5 of Luzon's entire forecast peak demand in 2026. A data center cannot simply stop whenever the grid runs short. Neither can a semiconductor factory, where even a short blackout can ruin work already moving through the production line. BCDA says the hub will produce its own electricity instead of relying entirely on the Luzon grid. So what power projects have actually been announced? The most concrete one is Aqua Power's planned solar and battery project, which the company says could reach up to 500 megawatt at full build-out. In capacity terms, that is around 1/6 of the hub's projected demand. But Aqua and BCDA haven't published the battery storage capacity or how long it could keep the hub running. BCDA also says a feasibility study is underway for at least 1.2 gigawatts of gas generation. But that is still only a study, so the projects announced publicly still don't explain where all 3 gigawatts will come from. BCDA now says private investors, not the government, would pay for the hub's power and water infrastructure. But it still hasn't published the full plan for generation, transmission, and backup power. If the hub's own supply fell short, will it draw from the Luzon grid, and under what conditions? And then there is water. BCDA estimates that Pax Silica could require between 65 million and 90 million liters every day. At the higher end, that's roughly 36 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The government says the hub will draw from surface water rather than community groundwater. BCDA says a proposed surface water harvesting system would initially supply up to 120 million liters a day. Surface waters come from rivers, lakes, and reservoirs. It can flow downstream, support farms, or replenish other water sources. So what happens during a severe dry season? How much water remains, who gets it first, and how much can be recycled? Now, let's place all of those facilities together. Data centers, semiconductor facilities, and mineral processing plants can produce wastewater and use chemicals, metals, and gases. Depending on what is built, they could also generate sludge and other hazardous waste. BCDA says every facility would need its own environmental compliance certificate, while the palace has promised safeguards for nearby communities. As of early August, I couldn't find a public application or study looking at the combined effects of the entire hub. So opponents want one study showing how the hub could affect the water supply, power systems, and surrounding communities. They also want those communities to see the findings and have a say before the major agreements are signed. The argument also extends beyond New Clark City. KMP, a national peasant movement, and Kalikasan, a nationwide environmental network, argued that demand for nickel and other critical minerals could intensify mining elsewhere and put pressure on mountains, watersheds, farms, and ancestral lands. No mine has been proposed inside the new Clark City hub. But those groups see Pax Silica as a supply chain that could affect communities across the country. And that brings us to the last question. Who would control the hub and whose laws would apply? You may have seen the claims the United States could lease the site for 99 years, but that number didn't come from nowhere. BCDA said it was an option, and Philippine law allows some foreign investors to lease private land for that long. But no public agreement shows that the United States or any company has actually received a 99-year lease. BCDA said the United States asked for the hub to operate under American law with diplomatic protection, and the Philippines rejected it. But Undersecretary of State Jacob Helberg said those reports were taken out of context, that what Washington wanted was legal certainty for investors. Those accounts do not match exactly, and the written request is not public, so we can't tell whether the two sides were describing the same proposal in different terms. And it's worth noting, even the project supporters draw a hard line here. Victor Manhit, president of the Strat-based Institute, a Manila think tank that backs Pax Silica, put it to me in writing. The hub should make investment easier, not create a separate jurisdiction where Philippine law does not apply. Then there's the question of what the Philippines would actually receive in return. If future tenants receive long leases, tax incentives, or publicly supported infrastructures, what benefit will they be required to provide? We still don't know the final lease length or what happens to the rent after the free period. Those terms are still being negotiated. Finally, we have to zoom out. Pax Silica is not only an industrial project, it is part of an American strategy to move important technology and mineral supply chains away from China. And China has noticed. The state media has called the Philippines a pawn in this strategy. For supporters, that creates the opportunity. Washington needs new partners, and the Philippines could use that need to attract investment and bargain for better industries. But opponents worry that the country could reduce its dependence on Chinese processing only to become dependent on American companies, patents, and decisions instead.
That being said, this is not us saying that we want to side with China. Like we do not want the monopoly to remain, right? But it does not mean that we want to replace a monopoly with another monopoly, with the US monopoly on this.
Joshua Mata describes the same concern in foreign policy terms.
The Philippine government should not be forced to decide whether they should side with Beijing or with Washington. For us, those are false choices. What's important is for us to have our own autonomous foreign policy.
Calixto Chiquiamco of the Foundation for Economic Freedom raised another possibility. If the zones were seen as a logistics hub during a future conflict over Taiwan, it could become a target. Now, that is a hypothetical risk, not evidence that the hub is already a military project. BCDA says the project will become commercial, and Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro has rejected the claim that it is driven by war. But advanced ships, data centers, and artificial intelligence can have civilian and military uses. So opponents want the final agreement to define what commercial means, who will monitor the companies, and what would happen if the technology were used for purposes beyond what the government has promised. So why oppose Pax Silica before it has even been built? For these groups, it is because the most important decisions happen before construction. Once land, utilities, and long term agreements are committed, it becomes harder to change who controls the project and bears its cost. That is why the opposition covers so much: wage ownership, land, indigenous rights, mining, water, electricity, pollution, sovereignty, and the Philippine place between the United States and China. So, after all of this, what can we actually say about Pax Silica right now? We know why the government wants it. The Philippines already has a large electronics industry, while the United States is looking for new suppliers outside China. And BCDA says around 30 companies have expressed interest. So there is a real opportunity here. But there are still too many unknowns. Ferrer supports Pax Silica, but at the end of our interview, he said the concerns around people, indigenous communities, power, and water were valid and should be discussed before the project gains traction.
No, and I like getting all the comments, good or bad, because we want to make sure that it's being discussed before the traction comes, right? Might as well iron out everything, all the concerns. Let's do it now. From people to indigenous tribes to power, water, they're all right questions and valid questions. So, Ian, we'll look in that.